Hello friends, and welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to talk a little bit about Stoic logic. I'm a little tired. It's been a busy work day today and a long weekend, and my kids for some reason have decided that they're going to get up before 6 a.m. for the last couple nights in a row. I have no idea why. So anyway, I got a cup of tea and ooh, that changed the white balance on my camera. Anyway, um, so let's talk about Stoic logic. I will go ahead and link to the other episode in this series on Stoic physics. In fact, I'm going to take all the Stoic episodes and I'm going to put them on a playlist once I'm done with them, and that way you guys can just kind of go through them. There's probably going to be at least one more and probably two more, maybe three, but I'm gonna say at least two more. We'll do one on Stoic ethics after we do this on Stoic logic, and then I'll do one on sort of the evolution of Stoicism. I would like to talk a little bit about areas of Stoicism that I've struggled with and sort of where I take it from there. And do I consider myself a Stoic? In what way, et cetera, et cetera, and also give some resources for people who are interested in kind of going down that road themselves. And I'll point you at some of the material that and institutions that have helped me in my journey in Stoicism. Not that I'm done with that by any stretch of the imagination. I don't claim to be an expert. I just am trying. This is actually, as an aside, this is actually something. Doing these videos is helpful for me because it helps me organize my thoughts, and my learning on the subject. So I hope you find them as useful as I have. Okay, so the word logic means something like speech or reasoning. We often think of logic in our culture as distinct from myth or storytelling, and actually the words are closely related. The word logic or logos and the word myth or muthos both can be used to refer to speech. Generally, muthos or mythos just refers to kind of the narrative story or a thing spoken, whereas logic often refers to the just the facts, ma'am aspects of it. In the scholastic tradition, derived mostly from Aristotle by way of Maimonides and Thomas Aquinas, we're probably familiar with the trivium, most familiar with the trivium of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, or an analysis of speech and the parts of speech, the meaning or content of speech and how to analyze speech to extract that content, and then also how to use speech persuasively. I'm not aware of any Stoic texts or that on rhetoric, or at least that are explicitly Stoic. I'm sure many Stoic teachers and practitioners studied rhetoric. It was just part of the education of every middle or upper class member of the Greco-Roman world, but I'm not aware of any texts on it explicitly. However, grammar is part of logic from the Stoic perspective. So much like how in our video on physics, I talked about how physics and metaphysics, or what we think of as physics and metaphysics, observations about the natural world and implications about what it means, are both subsumed under the heading physics for the Stoics. And in a similar way, both grammar and logic are subsumed under the heading of logic. So there is a Stoic grammar, and we'll talk a little bit about that too. You'll find probably that there's points where this meets up with our discussion on physics. And if you watched my video on emotional control in Stoicism, you'll find some concepts show up again here. So there are two great logical systems that we inherit from antiquity. One is the Aristotelian system. And that is what's referred to as term logic, because it deals with the relationship between terms: major term, minor term, middle term. So it's one that is that has a very, very strong pedigree, and it's absolutely, useful material, but it sort of requires that you isolate your terms and know exactly what you're talking about. Whereas Stoic logic is predicate logic, meaning it's not so much attempting to analyze the relationship of specific things as it is trying to look at the implications of our speech. So when you talk about grammar, and if you remember back in school where you talked about sentences having a subject and a predicate, well, Stoic logic, when it's called predicate logic, it's called that because it analyzes what's said of a subject. So the subject of the sentence is the thing we're talking about, and the predicate is what we say about that thing. And so you'll probably find Stoic logic to be very practical. And in fact, if you were to take a course on informal logic or critical thinking, or read a book on sort of not a really heavy symbolic logic book or something like that with weird symbols, but just something to help you parse news stories or rumors or things you hear in the world, or deal with disagreements, the kind of reasoning that they're going to teach you is much closer to the Stoic system than it is to the Aristotelian system. But both are good, and they both can be used in many cases for equal effect. The Stoic system was actually sort of lost or not understood for a long time after the collapse of the Roman Empire and the rise of the church and their adoption of Aristotle, as sort of the wellspring of what was to become scholastic philosophy. Stoic logic was never really, they didn't really quite, most of the documents weren't looked at, and the ones that were, they kind of didn't know what they were talking about. It was like, what is this stuff? And it wasn't until later that modern logic reached a certain point that people actually looked back on the Stoic system and started to understand where it was coming from. So the Stoic system may have had its origins in another philosophical school, the philosophical school of Megara. The Megaran school was renowned for their logicians, and there was a record of the founder of Stoicism, Zeno, studying under a Megaran philosopher by the name of Stilpo. So it's quite likely that the Stoic logic system may have at least been influenced by the Megaran system. That's kind of just an interesting historical fact. It's not super relevant, but I thought I'd mention it. So just like I mentioned, sentences have a subject and they have a predicate. And for a sentence to be meaningful, it has to be a complete sentence. So, for example, if someone was just to say, I went, or I am, you would look at them like, you are what? Like, what? You haven't expressed a complete thought. I don't know what that means. And similarly, the Stoics looked at the starting point of their logical system as what they referred to as a sayable or a lecta. And you might remember that from our physics video as the one of the four incorporeals that are nonetheless, in some sense, real. So the meaning of words, not so much necessarily the markings on the page or the breath in the air, but the conceptual load that we understand as having a meaning. And just like we expect sentences to be complete sentences, they felt that the lecta had to be complete and not incomplete. It had to be a complete sayable. And So, for example, we couldn't just say John is, we'd have to say John is tall. Now we've actually said something about John that we can look at. But this is still what's referred to as a simple, complete sayable. It just states a fact. Now that fact could be true or it could be false, and we can look in reference to the object specified, in this case somebody named John, and we can judge for ourselves whether we think that's an accurate statement or not. But there's not a lot for us to do in terms of logical analysis. It's more just a factual analysis. However, some sayables are, and they must be complete, complex, meaning that our truth claim is dependent, at least to some extent, on the structure of our argument. And those are the kinds of sayables that we can subject to logical analysis. We have a concept in modern philosophy where we talk about statements being valid and sound. So a valid argument is one in which the conclusion follows logically from the premises. A sound argument is a valid argument where the premises are also true, meaning that the conclusion must be true as well. So logic just gives us a test of validity. It doesn't necessarily tell us that the argument is a sound one, because we have to use our own judgment to ascertain whether or not the premises are true. But if they are, and the argument's valid, the conclusion must be true as well. So a complex sayable can come in a number of forms, but the Stoics felt that all of these could be reduced to 5 primary shapes, if you will. And these are the Stoic Syllogisms. They are referred to as axiomata, which just means they're foundational or self-evident. They don't attempt to prove these through any system. They just sort of say these are given to be true. And then if you can reduce any argument to a collection of these axiomata, then you're able to analyze whether or not that argument is valid. Now, the Stoic rules for doing that reduction have unfortunately been lost to us, but you can still use them to tease out the truth of arguments, as I'm sure you'll find if you pick them up and try to use them to help you in your own dilemmas and questions. So the 5 Stoic syllogisms are modus ponens, modus tollens, disjunction, modus ponens tollendo, and modus tollens ponendo. And I know that's a lot of weird words and you're like, what the hell did you just say? But I'll make them simple for you. So the first one is modus ponens, or the mode of putting. And it's just a simple if, then, therefore statement. I'm going to take a sip of tea. Hold on. So if I were to say to you, if it rained last night, then the grass will be wet. Also, it rained last night. Therefore, the grass will be wet. That's modus ponens. It's very simple. All I'm saying is first I'm establishing an if-then clause, then I'm affirming the if, and then the then follows logically. Mode of putting something forward. Pretty simple. Modus tollens is the mode of taking, and it's the same structure, but instead of putting something forward, I'm negating something. So in this case, I would start the same way. I would say, if it rained last night, then the grass will be wet. The grass is not wet, therefore it did not rain last night. So you can see it has the same basic structure, but the difference is in modus ponens, I'm saying if the first, then the second, the first, therefore the second. Whereas in modus tollens, I'm saying if the first, then the second, exactly the same, not the second, therefore not the first. And they have to have those relationships. You can't switch those around, because if you do, that no longer follows logically. You couldn't say, for example, and this is especially you need to be especially careful of this in modus tollens, because people mess this up all the time. Even people who who are pretty good with formal logic will mess this one up occasionally. So you can't say, for example, if it rained last night, then the grass will be wet. It didn't rain last night, therefore the grass isn't wet, because something else could have wet the grass. But if the grass is not wet, you know for a fact it must not have rained, because otherwise it would be wet. So enough of those two. The next one is a disjunction. And a disjunction is just saying that there's two things that go together and that they won't work together. They're incompatible. Cats and dogs fighting together, right? So therefore, if you have one of them, you can't have the other. And that's it. So if I said, I don't know, it can't be day and night at the same time. And then I said, well, it's daytime. Well, then it can't be night. Or it's nighttime. Well, therefore it can't be day. That's all it's saying. These two things don't belong together. Therefore, if you have one, you can't have the other. Simple disjunction. And then the last two are the mode of putting by taking and the mode of taking by putting. And I know that sounds weird, but these are or statements. So they're saying either or. Either you have one thing or you have the other. You have one, therefore you don't have the other. And likewise, you could say either you have one thing or the other. You do have one thing, therefore you don't have the other. So modus. So one of them, they both start with the either or statement, and then one of them affirms an option and eliminates the second, and the other one eliminates an option and therefore affirms the second. So this is sometimes what's referred to in modern logic as an exclusive or. This isn't exactly the same as how or is often used in modern logical systems or in, say, computer programming. But that's how the Stoics used it. So in summary, you have two forms of an if-then statement. You have an and statement, and you have two forms of an or statement. And those are the 5 Stoic syllogisms. So I'll put a link to some of that stuff if you want to look it up. Your mileage may vary, but I think if you haven't ever studied logic and you'd like to maybe read an introductory text, I'll put some recommendations. It's a good skill to have and to develop. So what do you do with this? How do you use it? Well, now we have to pull back and look at the larger Stoic understanding of both the purpose of human, or not purpose exactly, but the how they frame human speech, and also how they look at what's referred to as epistemology, or the theory of knowledge. So the Stoic theory of reasoning and knowledge starts with what they call an impression. So you may remember from my video on Stoic emotional control that I gave the analogy of the cylinder, and this is an analogy the Stoics themselves gave, that the human soul you can look at like a cylinder made of wax or some kind of metal substance, and when it encounters an event, that event pushes on it and it rolls it down a hill, and depending on the shape of the cylinder, it's going to move a particular direction. You're going to have a certain type of reaction. Well, kind of keeping with that same general physical analogy, an analogy about a thing, we can talk about the soul being something that receives impressions, and those impressions can be sensory impressions, but they can also be the products of reasoning. So according to the Stoics didn't make a distinction between, say, sensory information and a conclusion of an argument or a dream. All of those are impressions. It's just something that presents itself to your consciousness. The impression does not just appear in its pure form necessarily. There's what they call a first motion, and it's this is analogous to the emotional or instinctive reaction you have to something that happens or to a thought that pops into your head. And the first motion you have is to some extent dependent on your biology, to some extent on your personal history, and also the habits you've built up over time. It happens, they say, almost instantly. There is a gap, but it's a very small one. And depending on the type of impression, it might be almost non-existent. But the impression and the first movement or reaction get bundled together, and then they're presented as that bundle to the ruling part of your soul, your consciousness, as a single fact of what's occurring. And now you have a choice of whether or not you assent to that statement of fact. The Stoic teacher of mine, Chris Fisher, liked to talk about how in Stoicism you don't necessarily, whether or not you have free will is one thing, but you always have free won't. The Stoics believed that it is always up to you whether or not you choose to assent to the impression. You don't have a choice about the impression, nor do you necessarily have a choice about the first motion that gets attached to it. That's, for most people, already too late by the time you're aware of the impression. It's already been sort of laden with emotional content, but you can choose whether or not you assent. You can say, yep, that's true, that's fact, that's what is, or you can say, wait a minute, hold on. Pause for a second, impression. Let's pull that apart and analyze it and really see if that's what you are. And that's where the logical analysis comes into play. So, and also the Stoic dogma. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I mean just in the sense of the Stoic teachings about what human nature is and how you should act in the world and what the world is like. And so you use those to sort of tease apart and analyze the impression and decide if it is in fact something you're going to assent to, or it's something you're going to say, no, that's not the way it is. That is a false impression. This process is referred to as Catechesis. Something like grasping or apprehending. So, for example, we might get in a car accident, and we might have the impression, so we have the impression of the accident, but then we also might feel the sense of guilt, and that's bad. And the question is, is it bad, or is it just something that happened? Or winning the lottery, is that, yes, you have an impression of winning the lottery. There are certain facts, material facts that actually occurred, but is that good or bad? Well, it depends on what you think makes things good or bad. From the Stoic perspective, from the pure classical Stoic perspective, it's at best a preferred indifferent, but it's not going to make you virtuous. And in fact, it could tempt you to unvirtuous behavior, which will make you miserable. As a matter of fact, many people, this is just an aside, but as a matter of fact, many people who win the lottery say that it ruined their lives because suddenly everyone's hitting them up for money and they blew it all. And, it just goes to show that there is perhaps some wisdom in the statement that happiness ultimately depends on the state of your character. Anyway, that aside, back to the topic at hand. So, impressions or the bundle can be adequate or cognitive. And an adequate impression is one that comes from what is, agrees with what is, and is imprinted in such a way that it can't not be what you think what it presents as. So, for example, the impression when you walk outside in the morning and the sun is beating down and the birds are chirping and you're awake and you have the impression that it's day. That is an adequate impression. It is but your impressions can also be interrupted, or they can be false. So a mirage in the desert is a great example. It looks like water shimmering in the distance, but it's actually not. It's just heat waves rising through the air. Or there might be impressions that you can't say are adequate or not because you simply don't have enough information. So, for example, there's an even number of stars in the sky. Sure, maybe, maybe not. That's not an adequate impression for cognition. This raises an interesting question about truth and validity and how you know that something is true, and are the human senses sufficient for detecting truth? And the Stoic position here is interesting. They held that it is at least possible for us to correctly apprehend the universe and facts. And it's not guaranteed. We can be mistaken, but we can be, at least in many cases, potentially right. And oftentimes in cases where we are mistaken, we can learn how to refine our perception and analysis in order to detect the truth. So they have an interesting position. It's not exactly the position that we are getting 100% of the truth from our senses and our comprehension ability, and it's not that we're just deluding ourselves. It's somewhere in between. It's I think, a very realistic position. It's one that says that human beings can grasp the truth, but that we're also fallible. But it's not necessarily that it's not necessary for us to be always correct, only for us to have the capacity to be correct and to be able to refine that capacity. They looked at the process of knowledge as something more than just a correct assent. A correct assent is a cognition, but it's not necessarily knowledge. They felt that knowledge was a self-referential system of correct assents. So it would not be enough to simply observe a fact and judge it correctly. That fact had to be integrated with a whole system of knowledge. And only once you constructed correctly the right outlook on life could you said to really have knowledge about the world. You could think of it as maybe wisdom. One example that was supposedly given historically was the metaphor of a hand. A hand is open and something is placed in it, and this is an impression. Grasping it and holding it with the mind would be assent, or at least, closing the fingers and touching it would be assent, and then cognition, and then knowledge would be fully absorbing that fact. Now, the Stoics, from this description, you're probably getting the impression that the Stoics are primarily looking at information coming from outside. And that's true. They were not fans of the Platonic concept of forms. In fact, they explicitly rejected them. They felt that the whole Platonic concept of forms was not something, that it was a phantasm. This actually led them to some weird places with universals. Universals are universal categories like man or dog. And maybe we'll get into that a little later when we talk about sort of sticking points in Stoicism. They present an argument about the nature of universals, and I don't find it particularly convincing, but maybe you'll get something out of it. So, would we say that the Stoics were empiricists, meaning did they hold that all knowledge comes in from the outside? Not entirely. So much like the fact of their relationship to the idea of God or the divine, and much like their theory about the power of human cognition, their theory about the origin of thinking is sort of not in either extreme category that we in the modern world like to put things in. So the Stoics felt that there were certain seeds. In fact, they used the word seed that are inborn in us, tendencies, if you will, and that all knowledge is built up on these fundamental seeds or tendencies. Epictetus gives a few, good and evil, honorable and base, becoming and unbecoming, happiness and misery, and that these basic pulls, if you will, are inherent in the human soul. He doesn't state that this list is necessarily an exhaustive list, so it's quite possible that the seeds that we have more than just that. But he's very clear that these are not cognitive content per se. They're more just like general, innate, instinctual tendencies, and that it's from these that we build up the content of our knowledge. But in order for us to make judgments about objects, they have to be in reference to something, and he felt that these seeds were the reference points. They were sort of the starting points, if you will, in our soul. Seneca elaborated on this as well and was clear to point out that the seeds are not knowledge themselves. They're just the starting points of knowledge. And that's about it. I wish you all a great night, and thank you for watching. And if you have any questions, please send them my way, and maybe we'll do a Q&A video or something like that. All right, be well. Is there anything else you'd like to tell everybody?
Yes!
What is that? What would you like to tell people?
I like to stretch this for being in the backyard and we play.
That's a good thing. Okay.
And
Let's say goodbye to everybody. Bye-bye.
bye-bye. Can we do it again?
Yeah.